بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
In the 7th century CE, a religion emerged from the deserts of Arabia that would transform the world in a manner and at a speed that has no real parallel in human history. Within a single century of the Prophet Muhammad's passing in 632 CE, the political boundaries of the early Islamic state had extended from the Iberian Peninsula in the west to the Indian subcontinent in the east, encompassing Persia, the Levant, Egypt, and the entirety of North Africa. By the height of the Umayyad Caliphate, a new civilization had established itself across 3 continents, replacing 2 of the ancient world's most formidable empires. This story, how a faith born in the deserts of Hijaz became the religion of over 1 billion people across every continent, is one of the most fascinating and most fiercely debated questions in the history of religion and civilization. Was this expansion a divinely guided mission carried on the wings of a compelling spiritual message? Was it the product of military conquest imposed on populations who had no choice? Or was it the slow accumulation of individual choices made by merchants, mystics, and ordinary people across centuries? As we will see, the reality is far more complex, more nuanced, and more intellectually honest than any single narrative, whether of triumphalism or of condemnation, is able to capture. Let us begin. To understand how Islam spread, we must first look at the astonishing speed of the early Arab conquests. Following the death of the Prophet Muhammad in 632 CE, his successors, known as the Rashidun Caliphs, launched a series of military campaigns that would change the world forever. Within a few decades, Muslim armies had swept through the Byzantine and Sasanian empires, conquering the Levant, Egypt, Persia, and North Africa. By 750 CE, the Umayyad Caliphate ruled a territory stretching from modern-day Spain and Portugal in the west all the way to the Indus Valley in the east. The sheer speed of this expansion was breathtaking. Within 100 years, a unified Arab empire had replaced 2 of the world's most powerful civilizations, the Byzantine and Sasanian empires, and had established a new political and cultural order across 3 continents. A critical distinction, however, must be made at the outset: the initial Arab conquests did not automatically mean the conversion of vast populations to Islam. For the first few centuries of Islamic rule, only a small fraction of the people living under Muslim rule actually converted to the new faith. Most of the conquered peoples, including the vast Christian and Zoroastrian populations of the Middle East and Persia, remained non-Muslim for generations, and in some regions for centuries. In Egypt, for example, it took a full 300 years for Muslims to form a simple majority of the population. This distinction between political expansion and religious conversion is crucial for understanding the true nature of Islam's spread. This brings us to the nuanced reality of the spread. Did Islam spread through trade, preaching, dawah, or military expansion? The answer, supported by scholars, is that it was all 3, operating in different times, places, and contexts. There is no denying that early Muslim armies conquered vast territories through military force. The resources of a unified, motivated Arab-Muslim force, combined with the weakness of the war-exhausted Byzantine and Sasanian empires, enabled these lightning campaigns. However, the nature of this military expansion is frequently misunderstood. Islamic law, based on the Quranic command, "There is no compulsion in religion," strictly prohibits forced conversions. When Muslim armies conquered a territory, non-Muslims were not forced to convert. Instead, they were offered a pact known as the dhimma. They could continue practicing their faith, administer their own communal affairs, and receive protection from the Muslim state, all in exchange for paying a special tax called the jizya. Non-Muslims were also exempted from military service and the charitable taxes required of Muslims. If military conquest did not bring mass conversion, why did it take so long for conquered populations to embrace Islam? Part of the answer is theological, cultural, and personal. Genuine religious change, especially at the communal level, is a slow process in any tradition. But there is also a striking political explanation that is rarely discussed. The Umayyad caliphs, who ruled the vast Arab Empire from 661 to 750 CE, actively discouraged mass conversions for economic reasons. The jizya tax levied on non-Muslim subjects was one of the most important revenue streams of the empire. A mass conversion of the subject population would, quite literally, eliminate a major source of imperial income. Many Umayyad governors and officials therefore had a clear financial disincentive to promote Islam among their subjects. There are documented cases of Umayyad administrators resisting or discouraging the conversion of non-Arabs, and even of converts being denied the full social and fiscal benefits of conversion because the state did not want to lose the revenue. This is a deeply ironic historical reality. For much of the first century of Islamic political rule, the political authorities were not actively promoting conversion, and in some cases were working against it. The spread of Islam as a faith, therefore, cannot be primarily attributed to state coercion. It happened despite, not because of many of the political calculations of the early rulers. Of all the mechanisms through which Islam spread, the one with the deepest long-term global impact may be the least dramatic, which is trade. From the 7th century onwards, Muslim merchants traveled the world's most important commercial routes, overland through Central Asia and into China along the Silk Road and by sea across the Indian Ocean, bringing not only goods but their beliefs, their ethics, their ways of conducting business, and their personal example. The Indian Ocean trade routes were particularly significant. Long before any Muslim army had set foot on the Indian subcontinent, Arab Muslim traders had sailed the monsoon winds to the shores of Kerala and Gujarat. They established enduring trading communities, learned local languages, married local women, and became integrated into the social fabric of coastal Indian society. India's first mosque was reportedly built in the state of Kerala at Kodungalur, also known as Cranganore or Muziris, in 629 CE, before the Prophet had even left this physical world. The faith arrived in India through commerce, not conquest. This pattern replicated itself across the known world. In West Africa, trans-Saharan trade routes carried Muslim merchants into the kingdoms of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. In East Africa, the monsoon winds brought Arab traders to the Swahili coast, where a distinctive Islamic culture would develop over centuries. In China, Muslim communities took root in the trading ports of the south and the caravan cities of the northwest. In each case, the merchant preceded the soldier, and in many cases, no soldier ever came at all. What made Muslim merchants such effective carriers of their faith is the Islamic tradition of honesty and integrity in commercial dealings, mandated by the Quran and Sunnah, gave Muslim traders a reputation for trustworthiness that was commercially valuable and personally compelling. The visible piety of Muslim merchants, their daily prayers, their fasting, their ethical conduct in the marketplace, was often the first encounter that local populations had with Islam. It was an encounter with embodied faith rather than abstract doctrine. Islam carries within it a strong missionary tradition known as dawah, the act of inviting others to understand and consider the message of Islam. This is not merely a cultural practice, it is grounded in the prophetic model and in the Quranic injunction, Surah An-Nahl, verse 125, in which Allah commands, "Invite to the way of your Lord with wisdom and good instruction, and argue with them in a way that is best." The spread of Islam through dawah was personal, relational, and contextual. It operated not through institutional structures of missionary activity but through individual Muslims, merchants, travelers, scholars, and mystics, who carried their faith with them and shared it through conversation, example, and invitation. The Prophet instructed his community to be tolerant in presenting the message, to engage with potential believers with gentleness, and not to alienate those who were still considering. No discussion of how Islam spread is complete without addressing the pivotal role of the Sufi mystics, the tradition of Islamic spirituality that emphasized the inner dimensions of faith, the love of Allah, and the purification of the heart. In regions as diverse as India, Central Asia, the Malay Archipelago, West Africa, and Sub-Saharan Africa, it was primarily Sufi missionaries and teachers, not armies, who introduced Islam to the majority of those who eventually embraced it. The Sufis possessed qualities that made them extraordinarily effective as carriers of the faith to new populations. They worked closely with Muslim traders along major trade routes, establishing communities where spiritual teaching was intertwined with commercial life. They presented an Islam that emphasized love, inner transformation, and the direct experience of the divine, a presentation that resonated across cultural boundaries in ways that a purely legalistic or political Islam might not. And crucially, they demonstrated a sensitivity to local customs and spiritual frameworks that allowed them to meet people where they were, rather than demanding immediate cultural transformation as the price of conversion. As Muslim merchants and missionaries settled in new lands, they frequently formed families with local women. This was not merely a social phenomenon, it was a primary mechanism of religious transmission. The women who married Muslim men often became the first converts in their families and communities. They raised their children as Muslims. They embedded Islamic prayers, values, and practices into the domestic life of communities that had no prior contact with the faith. Over generations, these family networks became the social infrastructure of Muslim communities far from the Arabian heartland. The children of mixed marriages, often speaking the local language as their mother tongue, familiar with local customs and social structures, but raised in a Muslim household, became natural bridges between Islam and the communities it was entering. This organic, generational process of religious transmission through family and social networks was, in much of the world, the primary mechanism through which Islam actually spread. Wherever Muslims migrated, whether as merchants, scholars, refugees, or in some cases as enslaved people who carried their faith with them even into bondage, they carried the embodied knowledge and practice of Islam. The annual Hajj pilgrimage to Makkah served, and continues to serve, as one of the most powerful unifying mechanisms in the entire religious world. Hundreds of thousands of Muslims from every continent, every language, every social background, gathered annually in the same place, performing the same rites, in the same garments, before the same Lord. The Hajj was not merely a spiritual act. It was a global information network, a marketplace of ideas, a forum for political discussion, and a renewal of the sense of collective identity, the Ummah, the global community of believers, that transcended every particular culture and geography. Scholars, merchants, and rulers who met at Hajj carried back to their home communities not just spiritual renewal but new knowledge, new connections, and in many cases a deepened commitment to spreading the faith they had shared with people from across the known world. The spread of Islam was not a single uniform process. It looked profoundly different in different parts of the world, and understanding those differences is essential to understanding the whole picture. The spread of Islam to Indonesia, Malaysia, Brunei, and the southern Philippines is perhaps the clearest example of peaceful, trade-driven expansion in the entire history of the religion. Not a single Muslim army of conquest arrived in these regions. What arrived instead were Muslim traders, Arabs, Indians, and eventually Malay Muslims themselves, and in their wake, Sufi missionaries who found in the spiritual sensibilities of Southeast Asian cultures a receptive audience. The result was a form of Islam that integrated with local artistic and cultural traditions in ways that produced distinctive regional expressions, the gamelan music of Java, the batik textiles carrying Islamic geometric patterns, the syncretic spiritual traditions of the Pesantren educational system. Today, Indonesia is the largest Muslim-majority country in the world, with over 230 million Muslims, and not a single one of their ancestors was converted by the sword. Their Islam arrived on the monsoon winds in the sails of trading dhows. Islam first arrived in India not through the armies of Muhammad ibn Qasim's conquest of Sindh in 711 CE, but through Arab traders on the Malabar coast in the preceding century. The mosque at Kodungallur predates the conquest of Sindh by nearly a century. The subsequent history of Islam in India involves both conquest, most significantly the Delhi Sultanate from the 13th century and the Mughal Empire from the 16th, and the parallel, often more deeply influential, work of the Sufi saints who operated largely independently of political structures. The two tracks coexisted. Military political expansion created the political space, while the Sufi tradition did the deep cultural and spiritual work of genuine religious transmission. The extent to which the Sufi tradition, rather than political coercion, drove conversion is evidenced by the pattern of conversion itself. The communities that converted most extensively and most durably to Islam in India were often those at the social margins, artisan communities, lower caste communities, communities in geographic regions far from the centers of sultanate power, whose conversion was driven by the appeal of the message rather than by proximity to political authority. In the regions geographically closest to Arabia, military conquest was indeed the primary initial vehicle of political expansion. But as the 300-year conversion timeline of Egypt demonstrates, conquest and conversion were separate processes operating on very different timescales. The Islamization of Syria, Iraq, Persia, and North Africa was a slow, centuries-long process driven ultimately by social, cultural, economic, and spiritual factors rather than by any form of coercion. Muslim armies conquered the Iberian Peninsula beginning in 711 CE under the leadership of Tariq ibn Ziyad, whose crossing of the strait that would bear his name, Jabal al-Tariq, Gibraltar, is one of the most dramatic moments in medieval history. But the majority of the population of Al-Andalus remained Christian throughout the period of Muslim rule. Jews maintained their communities and, in many periods, flourished intellectually and commercially under the relatively tolerant conditions of Andalusian Muslim governance. The Islamization of the region was far from complete by the time the Christian Reconquista began systematically reversing Muslim political control from the 11th century onwards. The story of Al-Andalus is, in fact, one of the most powerful rebuttals to the simplistic, sword, narrative. Muslim rulers governed a majority non-Muslim population for centuries, and that population retained its faith, its institutions, and in many respects its cultural life. Now let's move on to an important topic, the claim that Islam was spread by the sword, which is among the most persistent and most thoroughly debunked mischaracterizations in religious history. It has roots in medieval Christian polemics designed to justify the Crusades and to portray the Islamic world as an inherently violent and threatening civilization. It was revived and systematized during the period of European colonialism, when the need to justify the conquest and administration of Muslim-majority societies created an academic and popular incentive to present those societies as historically barbaric. And it continues to be deployed in the contemporary period by political actors who benefit from the portrayal of Islam as an inherently violent faith. Western historians, including scholars who have no religious stake in defending Islam, have largely and decisively rejected this narrative. Sir Thomas W. Arnold, the British scholar whose 1896 work The Preaching of Islam remains a landmark in the field, documented extensively that the conversion of vast populations to Islam was driven by preaching, trade, and the appeal of the message rather than by military coercion, and concluded that the historical evidence simply does not support the forced conversion thesis. Contemporary historians are equally clear. The claim that Islam was systematically spread by forced conversion is considered by the overwhelming consensus of modern scholarship to be a historical myth, one that no serious historian accepts in the assessment of multiple scholarly authorities on the subject. The scholar David Liepert articulated a distinction that cuts through much of the confusion with admirable precision. Islam didn't spread by the sword, the Arabs did. This is not wordplay. It is a substantive historical observation. The early Arab conquests were part of a broader historical pattern of imperial expansion, driven by the political unification of the Arabian Peninsula under Islam, the exhaustion and vulnerability of the surrounding empires, and the military energy of a newly unified people who had previously directed their tribal raiding culture internally. The Prophet channeled the formerly fractious, constantly warring Arab tribes into a unified community and turned their outward energy into conquest. But this political and military expansion was categorically distinct from the religious process of conversion. The Arab Empire expanded violently. The faith of Islam spread primarily through other means, through the quality of Muslim conduct and character, through trade networks, through Sufi spiritual teaching, through the appeal of a message that offered genuine answers to the deepest human questions. The most powerful refutation of the forced conversion thesis is simply this: if Muslim conquerors had systematically forced conversion at the point of a sword, how do we explain the continued existence of large, organized Christian, Jewish, Zoroastrian, Hindu, and Buddhist communities for centuries, and in many cases for over a millennium, under Muslim political rule? Christians in Egypt, Syria, and the Levant. Jews across North Africa, the Middle East, and Persia. Zoroastrians in Persia. Hindus and Buddhists in the Indian subcontinent and Southeast Asia. All of these communities survived, maintained their institutions, preserved their scriptures, and in many cases flourished intellectually and commercially under Muslim governance. They did so because the Dhima system, whatever its limitations by modern standards, genuinely protected the right of non-Muslim subjects to practice their faith. The survival of these communities across centuries of Muslim rule is historical proof that forced conversion was not the norm. If it had been, they would not have survived. Intellectual honesty requires acknowledging that the historical record is not without blemish. There were rulers in Islamic history who violated the clear prohibitions of their own tradition and engaged in acts of coercion. The Ottoman Devshirme system, which forcibly conscripted Christian boys from Balkan communities to serve in the imperial administration and army, and in the process often resulted in their conversion to Islam, is one documented example of a practice that conflicted with classical Islamic principles even as it served imperial interests. There are documented instances of forced or pressured conversions in parts of South Asia under certain rulers. These instances are real, they are documented, and they deserve acknowledgement. But they are exceptions, condemned by the classical tradition's own standards, representing the conduct of particular rulers rather than the command of the faith, and statistically marginal compared to the vastly larger process of voluntary conversion that constituted the actual mechanism of Islam's global spread. To treat the exceptions as the rule is not historical analysis, it is polemic. Now the question arises, if the sword did not convert people, what did? Historians and sociologists have identified several powerful and interlocking factors. Beginning with the revolutionary message of social equality, for vast populations living under the rigid hierarchies of the Byzantine and Sasanian empires, systems of feudalism, ecclesiastical privilege, ethnic stratification, and hereditary class, Islam's message of fundamental spiritual equality was genuinely revolutionary. In the sight of Allah, no Arab was superior to a non-Arab, no wealthy man superior to a poor one, no free person superior to an enslaved one, except by their God consciousness and their deeds. The Prophet declared this explicitly and memorably in his farewell sermon, and the Quran established it as a theological principle in Surah Al-Hujurat, verse 13, in which Allah says, "O humanity, indeed we have created you from male and female, and made you peoples and tribes that you may know one another. Indeed, the most noble of you in the sight of Allah is the most righteous of you. This was not merely a spiritual claim. It had practical, social consequences in the communities that adopted Islam. Former slaves stood in the same prayer rows as former masters. Former outcasts found in the mosque a dignity that their surrounding social structures denied them. The visible, embodied equality of Islamic worship, the physical proximity of rich and poor in the same rows, bowing and prostrating together before the same Lord, was itself a powerful social statement that had no equivalent in the stratified religious structures of the Byzantine or Persian worlds. Islam offered something unprecedented, a new form of collective identity that transcended every existing boundary of tribe, ethnicity, language, and nationality. The Ummah, the global community of believers, was not merely an abstract ideal. It was made concrete in the daily prayers that synchronized Muslims locally, and in the annual Hajj that brought them together globally. To convert to Islam was to join a community that extended across the known world and that owed its primary loyalty to a set of values rather than to an ethnic or tribal lineage. In a world where identity was typically fixed by birth into a tribe, a class, or an ethnic community, the possibility of choosing a new identity, one defined by voluntary commitment to a set of beliefs and practices, and one that instantly connected the individual to a global network of fellow believers, was genuinely transformative. Unlike many of the ancient world's religious traditions, which were explicitly tied to particular peoples, territories, or ethnic identities, Islam presented itself from the outset as a universal message addressed to all of humanity regardless of origin. Allah says, in Surah Al-Anbiya, verse 107, "We have sent you as a mercy to all the worlds." This universality made Islam an option for anyone, from any background, without the need to adopt a foreign ethnic or cultural identity as the price of admission. A Persian did not need to become an Arab to be a Muslim, a Berber did not need to adopt the customs of Arabia, a Malay did not need to become a Middle Easterner. They brought their languages, their cultures, and their social structures into Islam and made it their own, producing the extraordinary diversity of Islamic civilizations across the world. In a world where polytheism involved navigating the demands and preferences of multiple deities, and where Christianity was racked by complex and sometimes violent Christological controversies about the precise nature of Jesus' relationship to God, controversies that had produced the Council of Nicaea, the Council of Chalcedon, the Monophysite split, and decades of imperial persecution of theological minorities, Islam's message of pure, uncompromising Tawheed was intellectually satisfying in a way that many found liberating. One God. Absolute, indivisible, without partner, without consort, without son, without equal. A God who required no intermediary, who could be approached directly in prayer by any human being in any language at any moment. A theology that was simple enough for a child to understand and deep enough to occupy the greatest intellects for a lifetime. For many converts across many cultures, this clarity was itself a powerful argument for the truth of the message. Conversion to Islam also carried tangible social and economic benefits, and honesty requires acknowledging this alongside the more elevated spiritual motivations. Conversion could mean exemption from the jizya tax. It opened doors to participation in the social and professional networks of the Muslim community. It offered pathways into the imperial administration for those with talent and ambition. However, the historical record also shows the limits of this explanation. For much of the first 2 centuries of Islamic rule, the benefits of conversion were often not available to non-Arab converts, also called as the Mawali, who were sometimes treated as second-class citizens within the Muslim community itself despite their conversion. The famous Abbasid revolution of 750 CE was partly driven by the resentment of Persian and other non-Arab Muslims at precisely this discrimination. The fact that mass conversion continued and accelerated even when the immediate material benefits were limited or unavailable suggests that the deeper appeal of the faith, its spiritual, intellectual, and social dimensions, was the primary. Did Islamic teachings offer something unique compared to other belief systems at the time? The answer is a clear yes. And the historical context makes this vivid. In the specific milieu of 7th century Arabia, and then in the broader context of the late antique world that Islam entered and transformed, the package of teachings that Islam brought was genuinely unprecedented in its comprehensiveness and its applicability. In the Arabia of 610 CE, a society of tribal feuding, female infanticide, hereditary slavery, and commercial exploitation, Islam arrived with a reform program of extraordinary scope. It abolished female infanticide, explicitly condemning it in the Quran in Surah At-Takwir, verses 8 and 9. And when the girl buried alive is asked, for what sin she was killed, it gave women explicit rights of inheritance in Surah An-Nisa, verse 7, in which Allah says, for men is a share of what the parents and close relatives leave, and for women is a share of what the parents and close relatives leave. It mandated the consent of women in marriage. It established a system of mandatory charitable giving, the zakah, that institutionalized the economic obligation of the wealthy toward the poor. It declared the brotherhood of all believers across all tribal lines, dissolving in a single generation a social structure that had existed for centuries. It brought a scripture, the Quran, that was simultaneously a theological masterpiece, a legal code, an ethical framework, and a literary miracle in its own language. The Quran did not merely tell people what to believe, it provided a blueprint for an entire society, a faith-based civilization in seed form. No previous religious text had attempted anything quite like this in so compressed and comprehensive a manner. The contrast with the alternatives available to the populations Islam encountered was striking. Byzantine Christianity was exhausted by violent internal theological controversy. The Chalcedonian Monophysite split had divided the Christian communities of Egypt and Syria from the Imperial Church in Constantinople, leaving many Coptic and Syriac Christians already alienated from the political religious order that the Byzantine Empire represented. Zoroastrianism was so intimately tied to the Sasanian state that its collapse made the religion's future uncertain. Into this landscape came a message that offered not just a new theology but a new social order, one that had already proved its viability in the transformation of Arabia within a single prophetic lifetime. So, why do global narratives on the spread of Islam differ so dramatically? The answer lies in historiography, the study of how history is written, framed, and for whom. Orientalist and Eurocentric paradigms, Western historiography, shaped by Hegelian and Orientalist thought, often presented a linear, Eurocentric view of civilization, where the rise of Islam was an interruption or a threat. Muslim history was filtered through a lens that presumed Western superiority. Political instrumentalization of historiography, historical narratives are not neutral. In early Muslim historiography, the interplay between history and the religio-political contexts of the historians themselves is evident. The conquerors narrated events to align with divine will, while the conquered or their descendants narrated them as a calamity. In the modern era, the spread by the sword narrative is not just a historical debate, it's a tool in contemporary identity politics, used to frame Islam as a religion of the other in European school textbooks for the last 500 years. Post-colonial and revisionist history, modern scholarship has increasingly challenged these narratives, focusing on the long, slow, and peaceful processes of conversion through trade and Sufism, as documented in works like the New Cambridge History of Islam. Now, The critical final question arises: who benefits from portraying Islam as inherently violent, or conversely, as entirely peaceful? Portraying Islam as violent, the Islamophobia industry, this narrative is a billion-dollar industry. It benefits political opportunists, authoritarian leaders and far-right politicians manufacture an internal enemy to distract from economic failures and to galvanize a frightened voter base. Fear is a powerful electoral tool. The national security sector, a perpetual war on terror, justifies massive military budgets, surveillance, and the erosion of civil liberties. An external, monolithic enemy is a convenient justification for a post-Cold War security apparatus. Portraying Islam as pure pacifism, an apologist narrative while less monetarily profitable, a whitewashed narrative also has its beneficiaries. Apologists seeking to defend the faith, some Muslims, reacting to the relentless attacks, may overcorrect and erase the authentic military history of the early Islamic State, inadvertently denying the reality of the Islamic conquests. A dishonest peace. This serves an agenda of conflict avoidance, but at the cost of intellectual honesty, leaving sincere inquirers with unanswered questions and making the faith appear historically naive. The true story of how Islam spread across the world is not a story of a single factor, not the sword, not the merchant, not the saint. It is a complex, centuries-long historical process in which different forces operated in different proportions in different times and places, and in which the distinction between political expansion and religious conversion is absolutely essential to understanding what actually happened. The first key lesson is the distinction between conquest and conversion. Arab armies conquered territories with remarkable speed. But the conversion of whole populations to Islam happened slowly, gradually, and, in the overwhelming majority of cases, voluntarily. These are two separate historical processes that must not be conflated. The second key lesson is the centrality of trade and the Sufi tradition as the primary engines of Islam's global spread. In the world's most populous Muslim regions today, Southeast Asia and South Asia, Islam arrived not through military force but through the monsoon winds of the Indian Ocean trade, and was deepened through the spiritual teaching of Sufi saints who met people where they were and offered them a path of inner transformation. The third key lesson is the appeal of the message itself. Islam spread because it offered genuine answers to genuine human needs, the need for dignity in the face of social stratification, the need for belonging in a community that transcended tribal and ethnic boundaries, the need for intellectual clarity about the nature of God, and the need for a comprehensive framework for individual and social life. These were not manufactured attractions. They were and remain the substance of what the faith offers. The fourth key lesson is the importance of intellectual honesty about the military dimension. The early Muslim conquests were real. They involved real violence and real human cost. They also, in most cases, did not involve forced conversion, and the survival of large non-Muslim communities under centuries of Muslim rule is the clearest possible historical evidence of this. Acknowledging the military reality without distorting the religious phenomenon is the only honest path. The fifth key lesson is about the politics of historical narratives. The spread by the sword myth is not a neutral historical misunderstanding. It is a narrative with a history and a political function, rooted in medieval polemic and revived for modern purposes. Understanding why it persists, and who benefits from it, is as important as understanding the historical facts it distorts. And the sixth and perhaps most important lesson is about what this history reveals about the nature of the faith itself. A new religion emerged from the deserts of Arabia. Within a few centuries, 1 billion people from the forests of Indonesia to the savannas of West Africa, from the mountains of Central Asia to the coasts of East Africa, from the steppes of the Eurasian interior to the cities of the Mediterranean world, had come to call it their own. Not because they were forced, and not because they had no alternative, but because, when they encountered the message, in a merchant's honest dealings, in a Sufi mystic's teaching, in the clarity of the call to prayer at dawn, they found in it something true. That is the story of how Islam spread. It is far more interesting than the myth. And Allah knows best.